The radio crackled with static, then silence. Complete, suffocating silence that stretched across the barren hills of Camp Pendleton like a death sentence. Corporal Martinez lowered his rifle, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Another miss. His fourth miss in a row at what should have been a routine 800-meter shot. The target, a simple silhouette against the dusty backdrop, remained untouched, mocking him with its pristine condition. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Collins tried to hide his frustration, but the tight set of his jaw gave him away. This was supposed to be the Marine Corps' finest sniper school. These were supposed to be the best marksmen the Corps had to offer. Yet here they were, 6 weeks into the program, and half his students couldn't hit a barn door if it was painted fluorescent orange and singing the Marine Corps hymn. The problem wasn't new. For months now, the instructors at the Scout Sniper School had been watching their pass rates plummet. Young Marines who could thread a needle at 300 meters on the known distance range were suddenly struggling to connect with targets at distances that should have been child's play. The equipment was pristine. The ammunition was match grade. The weather conditions were textbook perfect. Yet something was fundamentally wrong. Martinez wasn't alone in his struggles. Down the firing line, Lance Corporal Thompson was having his own crisis of confidence. His breathing was perfect, his natural point of aim was solid, and his trigger squeeze was textbook smooth. But when the bullet left the barrel, it seemed to develop a mind of its own, sailing high and wide of its intended target. The mathematical precision he'd learned in the classroom evaporated the moment real-world variables entered the equation. The instructors had tried everything they could think of. They'd adjusted scopes, changed ammunition lots, and even brought in civilian contractors to verify their equipment. Every mechanical aspect of the shooting process had been examined, tested, and certified. The rifles were sub-minute of angle accurate. The optics were crystal clear and properly zeroed. The environmental conditions were being measured to the finest degree. Yet the fundamental problem persisted like a ghost in the machine. What made the situation even more frustrating was that these weren't inexperienced recruits fresh from boot camp. These were seasoned Marines, infantry veterans who had proven themselves in combat deployments. They understood weapons systems. They knew how to fight. But precision shooting at extended ranges was revealing gaps in their training that no one had anticipated. The modern Marine Corps had evolved rapidly over the past decade. Technology had advanced at breakneck speed, bringing with it digital ballistic calculators, laser rangefinders that could measure distance to the centimeter, and weather stations that could detect the slightest shift in atmospheric pressure. The new generation of Marines had grown up with these tools, becoming dependent on electronic solutions to problems that previous generations had solved through intuition and experience. But technology, for all its precision, couldn't account for everything. There were variables that no computer could calculate, subtleties that no digital readout could display. The way heat shimmer bent light rays, the way wind patterns changed as they flowed around terrain features, the way a shooter's own heartbeat could influence a shot at the moment of trigger break. These were lessons learned through years of practice, through countless hours behind a rifle, through the kind of patient observation that couldn't be downloaded or programmed. Staff Sergeant Collins knew they needed help, but he wasn't sure where to find it. The Marine marksmanship training in the world, but something was missing from their current approach. The old-timers, the Marines who had learned their craft in Vietnam and the Cold War era, were mostly retired now. Their knowledge was walking out the door with them, replaced by younger instructors who, while technically proficient, lacked the deep, intuitive understanding that came only from decades of experience. The breaking point came during a qualification exercise that should have been routine. The entire class, 24 of the Marine Corps' most promising marksmen, were given a standard engagement scenario. Multiple targets at various ranges, all well within their theoretical capabilities. The wind was minimal, the visibility was perfect, and the equipment was functioning flawlessly. It should have been a confidence builder, a chance for the students to demonstrate their skills and move forward in the program. Instead, it turned into a disaster. Miss after miss echoed across Frustrate the Range. Marines began second-guessing themselves, adjusting their scopes, changing their positions, doing everything except the one thing that might actually help them understand what was going wrong. The mathematical formulas they'd memorized weren't translating into hits on target. The technology they'd learned to rely on wasn't providing the answers they needed. Collins watched his students struggle, feeling his own confidence begin to waver. He was a good instructor, respected by his peers and trusted by his superiors. But he was also honest enough to admit when he was out of his depth. These Marines needed something he couldn't provide. They needed someone who understood not just the science of precision shooting, but the art of it as well. That evening, as he sat in his office reviewing the day's failures, Collins found himself thinking about the old stories he'd heard. Tales of legendary Marine snipers who could read wind patterns like sheet music, who could sense the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure that would affect a bullet's flight path. These weren't myths or exaggerations. These were real Marines who had developed skills through years of patient practice and careful observation. The problem was finding one of them who was still willing and able to share that knowledge. The Marine Corps had a proud tradition of taking care of its own, but it also had a tendency to move forward without always preserving the wisdom of the past. The institutional knowledge that should have been passed down through generations of instructors had been lost somewhere in the rush to embrace new technology and modern training methods. Collins pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. There had to be someone, some old salt, who still remembered how Marines used to learn precision shooting before computers and laser rangefinders took over. Someone who understood that while technology could enhance a shooter's capabilities, it could never replace the fundamental skills that came only through experience and patient practice. He paused at one name, a number he'd never actually called, but had kept for years. It belonged to a retired master gunnery sergeant who had served as a sniper instructor back in the 70s and 80s. Collins had heard stories about the man, whispered tales of impossible shots made under conditions that would challenge today's most advanced equipment. But the old Marine had been retired for over a decade, and Collins wasn't even sure the number was still good. Still, as he looked out the window at the darkening range where his students had struggled so mightily, he knew he had to try something different. The current approach wasn't working, and his Marines deserved better than continued failure. They needed someone who could bridge the gap between the old ways and the new, someone who understood that precision shooting was as much about reading the environment as it was about calculating trajectories. Collins stared at the number for a long moment before finally pressing the call button. The phone rang 3 times, then 4. He was about to hang up when a gravelly voice answered, weathered by decades of shouted commands and desert wind. "Turner here." "Master Gunnery Sergeant Turner, this is Staff Sergeant Collins from the Scout Sniper School at Pendleton. Sir, I know this is out of the blue, but I've got a problem I can't solve, and I was hoping you might be willing to help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Collins could hear the faint sound of a television in the background, maybe the evening news. When Turner spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had heard similar calls before. "What kind of problem, Staff Sergeant?" "My students can't hit anything beyond 600 meters, sir. They've got all the latest gear. They know the theory inside and out. But when it comes to making the shot, they're coming up empty. I've tried everything I can think of, but nothing's working." Another pause, longer this time. Collins found himself holding his breath, waiting for the older Marine to either hang up or tell him he was wasting his time. Instead, Turner asked a question that caught him completely off guard. "Tell me about their breathing, son. Not what they're supposed to do. What are they actually doing?" Collins blinked, caught off guard by the specificity of the question. "Their breathing? Well, they're following the manual. Natural respiratory pause, steady hold, smooth trigger press. That's what the book says. What are you seeing on the line?" The question forced Collins to really think about what he'd been observing. He realized that while he'd been focused on equipment and calculations, He hadn't been paying attention to the fundamentals that Turner was asking about. "To be honest, sir, I'm not sure. I've been so focused on the technical aspects that I might have missed what you're talking about." "Mm-hmm." Turner's voice carried no judgment, only understanding. "Staff Sergeant, how long have you been instructing?" 3 years, sir. "And before that?" "Infantry, 2 deployments to Afghanistan." "Good background. But let me ask you something else. When you learned to shoot precision, who taught you?" Collins thought back to his own sniper training. It had been conducted by instructors who, like him, had learned through the modern curriculum. Digital ballistics, computer-assisted range estimation, environmental sensors that could measure atmospheric conditions to the decimal point. "Honestly, sir, I learned pretty much the same way I'm teaching now." Maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe it is. Turner was quiet for a moment, and Collins could hear him moving around, perhaps settling into a chair. "Staff Sergeant, are you familiar with the concept of natural point of aim?" "Of course, sir. It's covered in Chapter 4 of the Marksmanship Manual. The shooter establishes a position where the rifle naturally points at the target without muscular tension. That's the definition. But do your Marines really understand it? Not the words, but the feeling? The way your body settles into perfect alignment when everything is right?" Collins found himself thinking about his own shooting. He knew the term, could recite the textbook explanation. But Turner's question made him realize there might be layers to the concept he'd never fully grasped. "I think they understand it intellectually, sir. Whether they feel exactly." Turner's voice took it might be a different story, on the tone of a teacher who had found the heart of the problem. "Son, what you're dealing with isn't a technical failure. It's a disconnect between knowledge and instinct. Your Marines have been taught to think their way through a shot instead of learning to feel it." The words hit Collins like a revelation. Everything his students had been taught was based on measurement and calculation. Range to target, wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity. They had devices that could quantify every environmental variable, but they'd never learned to sense those same conditions through their own observation and experience. "Sir, would you be willing to come out to the school? Maybe spend a day with my students?" Turner chuckled, a dry sound that carried both amusement and something that might have been sympathy. "Staff Sergeant, I'm 71 years old. My knees creak when I get out of bed, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. I'm not sure what help I'd be to a bunch of young Marines with all their fancy equipment. With respect, sir, I think you might be exactly what they need." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Turner asking probing questions about the students' backgrounds, their training progression, and the specific nature of their struggles. Collins found himself describing problems he hadn't even realized he'd been observing. The way his Marines seemed to fight their equipment instead of working with it. The way they relied on their instruments instead of trusting their own senses. The way they approached each shot like a mathematical equation instead of a conversation between shooter, rifle, and environment. By the end of the call, Turner had agreed to visit the school, but with conditions. He wouldn't come as an official instructor or consultant. He'd come as an observer, someone who might offer a different perspective on what the Marines were doing wrong. No fanfare, no formal introduction, just an old Marine who might have something useful to share. Collins hung up the phone with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He'd made the call out of desperation, but now he found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself and his students into. Turner represented a different era of Marine Corps marksmanship, a time when shooters had to develop skills that couldn't be programmed into a computer or displayed on a digital readout. The next morning, Collins gathered his students for what he described as a normal training evolution. He didn't mention Turner's impending arrival, partly because he wasn't sure the old Marine would actually show up, and partly because he wanted his students to perform naturally, without the pressure of knowing they were being evaluated by a legendary instructor. The Marines took their positions on the firing line, settling behind their rifles with the mechanical precision they'd been taught. Scopes were adjusted, range cards were consulted, and ballistic calculators were programmed with the morning's environmental data. Everything was done according to the manual, with the same methodical approach that had been failing them for weeks. Martinez settled behind his rifle, running through his mental checklist. Range 850 meters. Wind 3 to 5 miles per hour from the left. Temperature 68 degrees. Barometric pressure steady. His ballistic computer provided him with the precise elevation and windage corrections needed for the shot. Everything was calculated, measured, and verified. But as he settled into his position, something felt off. The rifle didn't seem to settle naturally against his shoulder. His breathing felt forced, deliberate rather than natural. The crosshairs wavered slightly as he tried to maintain perfect sight alignment, and he found himself fighting the rifle instead of working with it. Down the line, Thompson was experiencing similar struggles. His position looked perfect from a technical standpoint, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during dry fire practice. The weight of repeated failures was affecting his confidence, creating a cycle of doubt that made each subsequent shot more difficult than the last. Collins walked behind the firing line, observing his students with new eyes after his conversation with Turner. For the first time, he began to see the subtle signs of struggle that he gripped his rifle just had been missing. The way Martinez hissed his breath a fraction a bit too tightly. The way Thompson held too long before breaking the shot. The way all of his Marines seemed to be fighting an internal battle between what they'd been taught and what their instincts were telling them. It was then that Collins noticed the figure standing quietly at the edge of the range. An older man in faded jeans and a simple polo shirt, watching the evolution with the patient stillness of someone who had spent decades observing Marines learn to shoot. Turner had arrived without fanfare, just as he'd promised, ready to see what these young Marines were really struggling with. Turner moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades reading the subtle language of struggling shooters. He positioned himself where he could observe without interfering, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched Martinez line up for another attempt. The young Marine's form was textbook perfect, his position stable and consistent. But Turner's experienced eye caught something the manuals never addressed. The old master gunnery sergeant had seen this before, countless times over his 30-year career. Marines who could recite ballistic coefficients and wine formulas with mathematical precision, but who had never learned to feel the rhythm of their own heartbeat or sense the subtle shift in air pressure that preceded a wind change. They were trying to impose scientific order on an art that required intuitive understanding. Martinez squeezed the trigger with mechanical precision, following the exact technique he'd been drilled on for weeks. The shot broke clean. The recoil impulse felt normal, but the spotting scope revealed another miss. This one sailing wide right of the target. His frustration was palpable as he worked the bolt, chambering another round, while his confidence continued to erode. Turner watched the young Marine's reaction with knowing eyes. The boy was doing everything right according to the book, but he was fighting the shot instead of letting it happen. His breathing was too controlled, his grip too rigid, his entire approach too mechanical. It was like watching someone try to paint a masterpiece using only a ruler and compass. Technically perfect, but missing the soul that made the difference between competence and mastery. Collins noticed Turner's presence and walked over, trying to read the older Marine's expression. Turner's face remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was seeing exactly what he'd expected to find. The silence stretched between them as another shot rang out down the line, followed by the inevitable call of another miss from the spotting scope. After watching for nearly an hour, Turner finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper so the students couldn't hear. "The problem isn't with their shooting, son. It's with their thinking. They're calculating when they should be feeling, measuring when they should be sensing. You've got a generation of Marines who can tell you the exact atmospheric pressure, but they can't tell you whether the wind is picking up or dying down." Collins nodded slowly, beginning to understand what Turner was getting at. His students had been trained to rely on instruments that could quantify every variable, but they'd never developed the intuitive sense that allowed a shooter to read conditions that no machine could measure. They were trying to solve an equation when they should have been learning to listen to a conversation. Turner's gaze swept across the firing line, taking in the sight of 24 frustrated Marines who were beginning to question not just their shooting ability, but their competence as warriors. He'd seen this crisis of confidence before, had watched good Marines lose faith in themselves because they were trying to master their craft through pure intellect instead of developing the deeper understanding that came only through patient practice and careful observation. The breakthrough moment came when Thompson, in a moment of pure frustration, abandoned his calculated approach entirely. Instead of consulting his range card and ballistic computer, he simply settled behind his rifle and tried to feel what the shot required. He let his breathing find its natural rhythm, allowed his body to settle into the position that felt most comfortable, and trusted his instincts about the wind conditions he was observing through his scope. Turner watched the young Marine's transformation with growing interest. Thompson's entire demeanor had changed from mechanical precision to organic flow. His grip relaxed slightly. His breathing became less forced, and his trigger press seemed to emerge naturally from the shot sequence rather than being imposed upon it. When the bullet left the barrel, it found its mark with an authority that had been missing from every previous attempt. The impact on the rest of the class was immediate and profound. The sound of a successful hit after hours of misses created a ripple of excitement that ran down the firing line like electricity. But more importantly, it demonstrated that the solution to their problems wasn't to be found in better equipment or more precise calculations. It lay in developing the kind of instinctive understanding that Turner represented. Collins watched his student's success with a mixture of relief and realization. Thompson hadn't done anything dramatically different from a technical standpoint, but his entire approach had shifted from fighting the shot to allowing it to happen naturally. It was a subtle change that made all the difference, the kind of insight that couldn't be taught from a manual, but had to be discovered through experience and guidance. In the weeks that followed Turner's quiet intervention, the transformation at the Scout Sniper School was nothing short of remarkable. Pass rates climbed from their dismal lows to levels that exceeded even the program's historical standards. But more importantly, a generation of Marine marksmen had learned to bridge the gap between technological precision and intuitive mastery. They discovered that the most sophisticated equipment in the world meant nothing without the patient wisdom to read the subtle language that only the earth and wind could teach. Turner's legacy lived on, not in any manual or training doctrine, but in the quiet confidence of Marines who had learned to trust not just their instruments, but themselves. Sometimes the most profound lessons come not from advancing forward, but from remembering what we left behind.